I want to take a couple of minutes and talk about some of the experiences that we have had, continue to have, with the implementation of UDI, and really look forward to everyone's help as we continue down this path of trying to understand the details, particularly as Europe rolls in. I think this will be a big opportunity for all of us to really understand the details and how this is actually going to work. So with that, let me get into it a little bit more. Okay, keep moving along. We all understand at, I think, a very basic level. Obviously, we're all here at a GS1 conference. We understand at a basic level about product identification. And the question, though, really is, what is a medical product? And more specifically, globally, what is a medical device? And this may sound trivial. I'm sure Andrew spends much of his time on understanding medical devices, but what we find as we move through a wide range of device manufacturers is really a difficulty in understanding specifically what is a regulated medical device, what is a regulated medical device in any particular domain, any particular regulatory environment, and more specifically, what is an accessory to a medical device. And again, this may seem trivial. Obviously, we have accessories to medical devices, and we know probably from a regulatory perspective what they are. But when you actually look at a very broad spectrum of products that a manufacturer may have, what we find is that there are a lot of things that maybe we don't know specifically whether they are a regulated medical device. And so we see a process that needs to take place for a given device manufacturer, looking at their product portfolio and understanding really of everything that I distribute, everything that I manufacture, what is actually a regulated medical device. In the US, at least, we were helped in this process by a draft guidance that was published earlier in the year, talking about how we think about accessories to medical devices. If we go back a slide, if that's possible, we see the regulatory definition of a medical device in the United States, which includes the concept of accessories and components to medical devices. So accessories or components to medical devices are in themselves medical devices and therefore regulated as such and therefore are in fact subject to UDI. But looking through an entire product portfolio and deciding of all the bits and pieces that I distribute, what is actually an accessory or component to a medical device and therefore a medical device and therefore subject to UDI can be a challenge. And I wish Laurent and, well, those who come along with him in this journey in Europe to really spend some time talking about all of the accessories, all the components, all the ideas associated with those, and making it clear for manufacturers and those who are supporting manufacturers in the development of UDI what it really means to be a regulated medical product, or in this case, a regulated medical device. This is not easy. It is for some manufacturers, but for many, it really is not. We look at product portfolios that can be well over 100,000 products. Not all of those are regulated medical devices, and so I think it'll be interesting as we move from the US to other countries in the adoption of UDI in understanding of all of this very large product portfolio, which SKUs are actually regulated medical products and therefore subject to UDI. I think this will vary from country to country, so I think this will be one of the issues that we will have to address as we look at really harmonization of UDI moving forward. Some more information from the draft guidance talking about what accessories are, but I really want to get to a couple of other slides that talk about what are not regulated medical devices. So it's important, words become important at this point. If I have an accessory is a regulated medical device and therefore a medical device in and of itself and therefore subject to UDI. But we have other things. We have spare parts, for example, that are not. And there's a very good draft guidance document from the European Commission talking about really spare parts, what they are, and how they compare to accessories. so we can start to really segregate products and decide, in fact, whether or not they're regulated medical products. So again, spend some time with your product portfolio and really understand if you are a device manufacturer, you're helping those to become UDI compliant. I would suggest, Laurent, that you and your colleagues in the commission spend a little bit of time on this as well. We did not, in the U.S., spend much time on this issue, and I think it has become a problem for a number of device manufacturers moving forward. So some things that we think about when we talk about what device manufacturers need to do, we need to think about, again, their entire product portfolio, all the SKUs that they have, and understanding which each of these products are. Are they medical devices? Are they pharmaceutical products? Are they combination products? How are they regulated? What is their pre-market risk class? How did they get to market? This seems, again, to be maybe obvious to most, or it should be obvious, but it's not. You know, product families have evolved over time, and we see that there are additional components or accessories that are added as that product evolves and grows, and we find that it becomes quite difficult, in fact, to understand which each of these products are, how they came to market, again, what their pre-market risk class is, and how UDI should be applied to them. I'll talk a little bit more about labeler in a moment, one of our favorite topics, so I'll hold that for a moment. Configurable products, I want to spend a half a second on this. We see often a manufacturer will have a large, complex system. We think about X-ray systems or MRIs or the such, and really understanding how do I apply UDI to this array of components that come together at a particular point to create the finished medical device, and how should UDI apply to each of the components or the whole system or the whole finished system is an issue that, again, we did not spend a lot of time on, unfortunately, in the US, and has become quite problematic for many device manufacturers. So, Laurent, again, sorry not to pick on you, but as we move to UDI in Europe, I think understanding how UDI will work for these configurable systems will be critical. We touched on it in our work at IMDRF, and I'm looking at Volker and others who worked on that. And we talked about it generally, but we never did quite get to the specifics of how it really should work. So again, I encourage those who are operating in this space, and Laurent and your colleagues, spend some time on this, understand how this should work, so that we actually have an approach that is understandable moving forward. One of the other issues that we run into, is around where UDI goes. So in the US, and I'm sure we'll see something similar out of Europe, the default location for UDI is on the label of the device. So we have to ask ourselves, where is the label of the device? So label is really a regulatory concept. It is where other label information goes. It drives a whole series of activities, but it may not always be obvious, particularly to those in an organization who have responsibility for UDI, where that label is. Which sticky piece of paper that I put on my product or my package is actually the label of the device, and therefore where does UDI actually go? So we have to take a couple of steps back when we think about UDI application. We have to understand then, where is the label of our product? Are we going to put UDI on that label, or are we going to create another space for UDI? So again, we have to take a couple steps back, really understand from a regulatory perspective where our label is on our product, and then therefore where UDI should go. One of the other issues that we run into, depending particularly on where UDI resides in an organization, is this idea of UDI at a orderable unit, shippable unit, right? So I'm going to put UDI on a package or a box. Well, UDI belongs there as well, but it probably belongs on a level below that too. So really educating folks in organizations who are not used to regulatory concepts such as label, such as an individual device unit of use, as we've talked about, is critical to actually understanding how UDI is going to work for any particular device manufacturer. One of the other interesting issues that we run into, and hopefully this will translate well for most folks, is this idea of shipping container or shipper. So shipper, the other issue, and maybe we can start to actually create some harmonization in this space, there isn't a very good set of terminologies that describe product packaging. So we often talk, individual manufacturers will talk about a case or a package or a box or a shelf pack or a shipper, as if everyone else is using that term in the same way, and they're not. So many manufacturers will talk about a shipper as something that is sort of used only for the purposes of moving goods to a customer. That may be true, but in fact, that may also be a level of packaging that is subject to UDI. And getting people to appreciate that connection turns out to be quite a challenge. So a shipper is a box, I will grant you that, but a shipper may also be a device package that is in and of itself subject to UDI, at least in the US. There is a shipping container exception in the US, and I assume we'll see something similar from Europe. We get to a point of some pallet, if you will, or a tote that has a non-homogeneous set of items on it, which is in response to a particular order, and that is probably no longer subject to UDI, at least in the US. But making that transition from shipper to shipping container is not necessarily obvious. So spend some time, understand for your products how they're distributed if you are a device manufacturer, if you're helping them, and understand that shipper and that shipper is not the same as shipping container. So in the US as well, and I don't know, Laurent, if you will have anything like standardized date format. I guess you already have that, maybe? Not sure where that's going to go. So in the US, we also have this concept of standardized date format that is incorporated in the UDI regulation as well. And that often is something that people don't think about when they try to sort of make the jump between UDI and the standardized date format. And we see that standardized date format is needed on levels of label that may not be subject to UDI. So just a detail from a US implementation perspective. So one of our absolute favorite topics is the concept of labeler. This has turned out to be probably one of the most difficult aspects, believe it or not, of UDI adoption. One of the interesting things that I found is that UDI adoption is not difficult for reasons that I think we initially thought. People can assign GTINs, that's easy. Lots of people are in the business of making, barcode printing equipment, that's not too difficult. It's really the issues of understanding how UDI should apply, who should be responsible for it, the accessory conversation we just had, the labeler conversation we're about to have, that really makes UDI very, very difficult for many manufacturers. So in the US, we have this term manufacturer, and almost everyone who touches a medical device in one form or another is a device manufacturer, a specification developer, contract sterilizer, a contract manufacturer, an importer. All of these people are, from a US perspective, a device manufacturer. So then the issue becomes, from a UDI implementation perspective, who is responsible for UDI? Who is going to have their GTIN on the product? Who is going to create and submit the data to the good ID? Seems simple, right? In some situations, it is. In some situations, the device manufacturer is the labeler, the spec developer, the importer, the manufacturer, Dennis, most of your products are probably fairly straightforward. Volker, most of your products are fairly straightforward as well. But for many, when we get into these sort of complex relationships between the person who's manufacturing the product and the person who's actually putting that product into commercial distribution, we start to see some issues that arise. So in the US, in the UDI rule, we borrowed actually from the Center for Drugs this concept of labeler. And labeler is the person who causes the label to be applied to the device, which really doesn't make a whole lot of sense in reality, but that's what the rule says. And what it really means is that person who is responsible for the label of the product. Somebody is responsible for the information that is there, and therefore is responsible for that product as it moves in the US through commercial distribution. And so we call that person the labeler. And so when we look at this label, for example, and thank you, Tom, if you're in the room, my friends at Johnson & Johnson for this product label, we can see a typical situation in which we have a manufacturer that's listed there up in the top middle of the label, and then we have a distributor call it a distributor of the product here, Ethicon, J&J, another J&J company. And we have to ask ourselves, well, of those two organizations, for example, and we see even more complex examples of this, in this situation, who is responsible? Who should be responsible for UDI? What do you think? Okay. Everyone gives up? Okay, fair enough. The short answer is, at least in the US, FDA doesn't really care. Somebody has to be. Somebody has to be responsible, right? Somebody has to put a GTIN, and if we had our appropriate Batman decoder ring, we would find that that is actually a J&J GTIN. It's a J&J GS1 company prefix. But if you don't have your Batman decoder ring, you wouldn't know that. You wouldn't necessarily have that level of visibility. What happens, though, is things start to get very interesting when we look at FDA's UDI database, Good ID. And we look at a label, and we look at the data in the database, and we ask ourselves, does this make sense? If I was to look up this product in the Good ID database, and I was to look at the name of the labeler, what would I expect to see? I'm holding this label now, and I'm looking for information about this product in the database. Who would I expect to see as a labeler of the product? Manufacturer being this person? Anyone else? Everyone think? How about from a GS1 perspective? Who's the brand owner of this product? All right, so now you all get it, okay? This is the problem that we have, is that we have this disconnect between who we expect to see associated with the product, whose name is on the product, and how this all lines up. And I will tell you, because I have the appropriate level of visibility, that if you were to look in FDA's Good ID database, you would find some really strange examples. You would pick up a label, and you would look at it, and you would look in the database, and you would find someone's name that's not even on the label of the product. So there are some very odd things that are happening. And what needs to happen is that all of this information needs to start to line up in a way that I don't think to date we've necessarily had to do. So we need to come to some realization, some harmonization about how this is all going to play out. Maybe we need additional fields, maybe we need other names, maybe we need more definitions. Volker tried very hard in some documents that he sent me early on, trying to lay out how this should all work, but we're not there yet. We don't really know whose name should be associated with this product. And we see it play out day in, day out in a myriad of different ways that doesn't help us all really understand how this should work. So just some of the fun with UDI implementation. Some things to think about as you do this, if you are in this space, really understanding all of these relationships that you have with whether you're private labeling or whether you're a contract manufacturer on either side of those equations, really understanding how this looks today, how you want it to look. We find often that, for example, and again, this is only an example, that J&J really wants to be the labeler of this product. They want their name associated with it. The manufacturer may not be willing to go along with that view. They want to be the labeler of the product. So these are conversations that you need to have with your various partners as you move through this activity. And again, I would encourage you, if you haven't had a chance, and again, I'm not entirely sure how the database will play out in Europe, but if you have not had a chance, I would encourage you to look at FDA's public UDI database. It's very interesting to see what the data actually looks like when you're trying to use it. So take advantage of the system that is there and see what it looks like. See how the data represents itself. See how people are really presenting information and how you want that information to look for yourselves or the manufacturers that you're working with. Did I skip? Okay. And just to round out this whole conversation about labeler, some other definitions of manufacturer that are a little bit different than those in the US. And so we find that the idea of manufacturer, who is responsible for the product, varies from region to region. So though we are working on the global harmonization of UDI, we have some issues, device class, whether something is a medical device, the definition of manufacturer. We have a lot of issues that impact UDI implementation that are not necessarily harmonized globally. So again, some definitions of manufacturer, you'll find that these vary from region to region. Again, as I mentioned before, it's different in the US than it is here. And so who is responsible then will vary or could vary across various regions, across various regulators. Wow. I haven't had that before. Thank you, whoever. So one of the other issues that we have run into, and again, I'm at a GS1 conference, so I assume that this is not novel for most of you, but it is for many people in the medical device world, and that is around the idea of quality barcodes and barcode verification, all that means and why we do that. This catches everybody by surprise, and I am consistently amazed by it. And we spend a lot of time arguing with manufacturers about why they need to do barcode verification. There are many manufacturers who have been putting barcodes on products for years, GS1 barcodes, who have never, ever heard of a barcode verifier or verification or the idea that they need to do it. And so this becomes a point that if you haven't already, or if you're working with manufacturers, you will need to explain to them why they need to do this, what this entails. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge. This is a very disruptive activity to barcode printing, to actually moving labels along. And so actually putting this in play can be quite disruptive and quite difficult. So they push back quite a bit. So actually, I think I would encourage maybe GS1 to spend a little bit more time on this moving forward, both at a global level and an MO level, and to really help people to understand what it means to do barcode verification, why it's important, where it even sits in the standards, and to really help manufacturers along this path. Clock has gone red. Spend a couple of minutes talking about data, and there have been some very good sessions here. We've talked about master data, what that means, the importance of collecting this information, verifying this information. And I will say this again, I think I've said it every time that I have had the privilege to present here, that this is the hardest part of UDI implementation. We talked about some challenges in terms of identifying which products, labels, labeler. We've talked about some issues that are challenging, but in the end surmountable. Collecting, normalizing, verifying, submitting all of the data that's required for good ID is a huge undertaking. Huge. Do not underestimate the amount of work required here. This is the first time, at least in every client that we've had, this is the first time that we've had to bring all of this information together into one place and actually make sure that it is correct, right? We're talking about regulatory information here that's going to be submitted to a regulator, right? This is not something I'm sending to a partner or a client or someone who's buying my device. This is regulatory information, therefore it has to be correct. So moving through, understanding where all of this data lives, who owns it, and really getting it in shape so that you can submit it to FDA or submit it to another regulator as we watch the European database take shape is a huge challenge. I know, again, we've talked about attributes. We talk about roughly 62 attributes in the good ID. It's not really 62. It's a number that's less than that, but it's still an enormous amount of data that needs to be collected that, again, has not necessarily existed as a discrete data element in any system prior to the collection and submission of it for good ID. So again, if you haven't done this, I would encourage you to take a look at the database, see how the data is represented, see how different manufacturers have answered particular fields. Brand name is one of, a very good example where different manufacturers have approached the concept of brand name very differently. Understand some of the attributes, clinical size, for example, that really have created an enormous challenge moving forward, and I think we'll continue to, particularly as we roll out to other countries. I am over my time, so I will. I saw Ulrika gave me some more time. So, okay. This is the FDA's website. You will notice, in fact, that it is not an FDA website. If you can read the very small print at the top, it's actually a database that's run by the U.S. National Library of Medicine, and so don't be surprised when you see that. From here, you can do all sorts of things. These have since, just yesterday, become live, so you can actually access the data in a number of different ways. But search, spend some time, search, look at how different manufacturers have responded to this request for data. It's a very useful website to see how this is all represented. So if you have not seen it, I would encourage you to take a look. I want to talk very briefly, since Ulrika was kind enough to give me a few more minutes, about some of the exceptions in the U.S. and kind of what this means moving forward in other countries in Europe as we start to roll out UDI and understand the very subtle differences that I think are going to become very critical as we march towards a harmonized approach to UDI. One is the single-use device packaging exception. So in response to a number of manufacturers who were concerned about how UDI would apply to particularly low-cost medical devices that are single-use medical devices and are packaged together and distributed that way, we developed, and you see the same concept in the IMDRF guidance as you do in the US FDA rule, of the single-use device packaging exception. So, and it says essentially that if I keep this group of single-use devices together, that I can put a UDI on not the individual device, not on the label of that individual device, which again, as we talked about, is default location, but rather on the next higher level of packaging. It's a great tool, but what we find is that in reality, it doesn't necessarily work the way that manufacturers think. People will often not keep the devices together in that single device package. they will take them out, they will distribute them throughout the hospital or throughout the organization. So as you look towards implementation, as you look towards the use of these kinds of exceptions, I really encourage you to understand how your devices are actually distributed and used. It's really critical to understand that, to understand whether or not the use of this exception is practical or appropriate. And we're starting to see more and more of this as we march down from, in the US, from class 3 to class 2 and eventually down to class 1, that we find the use of some of these exceptions that we created appropriately maybe not being used in the way that we thought they should be. So understand them, and again, Laurent and your team, I encourage you to understand the practical realities of some of these exceptions and what they mean moving forward. The other one, which creates quite a bit of confusion in the US, is the idea of a kit exception. So what in the US we have is this exception that says if I put a UDI on the kit, convenience kit combination product, I don't need to put a UDI on the individual components. What we didn't say explicitly in the rule, and in retrospect I wish we did, was that this assumes that in fact the kit stays together over the life of that product, right? So understand the foundation, the mental model of this exception, and again, depending on how this plays out in Europe, I would encourage you to be very explicit about the use of the exception when it's appropriate and when it's not. In many situations it works quite well, but in the US we find that people are, I think, taking advantage of this, and we're finding UDI is not available for many medical devices because they're taking advantage of exceptions that maybe shouldn't be. The last exception I really want to talk about here is the existing inventory exception. And this is interesting, and Laurent, I don't know if you all have thought about this much, but we never talked about this. In all the work that we did over many, many years in the development of the UDI rule, we never really talked about existing inventory, product that manufacturers have ready to distribute up to that point, up to the compliance deadline. And so in response to the proposed rule, we got a number of comments and had to scramble a bit in the development of the final rule to really come up with an idea of what we call the existing inventory exception. And what it says is, if I have product that is manufactured, packaged, and labeled prior to the applicable compliance date, so one just passed, but let's talk about next year, we have class 2 products that need to be UDI compliant by September 24th of next year. What the existing inventory exception says, if I have these products already ready to go, I can continue to distribute those for an additional 3 years without them being UDI compliant. And this was really intended, as you can imagine, to support manufacturers and not create sort of a bottleneck as I'm getting products ready for distribution. But now I have products that are going to sit for 3 years without being UDI compliant. So I'm going to continue to see products in commercial distribution that are not UDI compliant. And I'm going to pick up 2 products that look very, very similar from the same manufacturer, and one will have a UDI on it and one will not. And why? So I think it's a useful tool properly applied. And I think 3 years was probably too long, and I'm sure my manufacturing colleagues would tell me it's probably too short. So, I think there's a balance here that we need to understand and appreciate, particularly as we move into other domains, other regulators, and apply it appropriately. There are situations where this works, but it's not intended to really relieve manufacturers of the responsibility, and I think many are using it in that way. So again, Laurent, something I would encourage you to work on moving forward. I'm going to skip this because it makes my head hurt to talk about it, and we'll maybe deal with that in another presentation on another day. The last thing I really wanted to talk about here is what in the U.S. we call the Conforming Amendments. And so these are changes made to other regulations to utilize UDI. So UDI does not exist in a vacuum, right? It's just not about putting an identifier on the label of a product, but in fact, all of these other regulatory activities are intended to operate at a UDI level. Post-market surveillance, adverse event reporting, recalls, complaint handling, whole series of them that are outlined here in a couple of slides that I provided for you, where UDI becomes a necessity, another regulatory necessity in other regulatory systems, other regulatory requirements. So remember, as you're developing your UDI solutions, as you're implementing UDI in your organization, remember it has effect in other parts of the organization as well. So be sure that you include all of the appropriate players, all the appropriate stakeholders. We have systems, we have SOPs that need to be updated to include UDI as we start moving forward. And this, in turn, turns out to be quite a challenge as well, really getting everyone up to speed, understanding that, for example, whoever is handling your complaints needs to now ask in that process, what is the UDI of the device that you're submitting a complaint about? So a number of changes that need to happen beyond sort of the basic identification that we've already talked about. This was mentioned already, so I'm not going to repeat this, but in the US, we're starting to see adoption of the UDI beyond sort of the regulatory domain. Some documents that came out recently from other regulatory agencies in the US requiring UDI to be used, for example, in patients' electronic health records. So we're actually starting to see adoption and implementation, at least in the US, beyond the regulatory domain of FDA. And that's good. I mean, we start to actually see some use. And I think this is where we start to close the loop now. We start to actually see, is the way that I've identified the product going to support the identification of that product over its entire life cycle? So this is where we're going to start to, I think, get some feedback and really understand if the way that we've thought about this, the way that we've implemented this is actually going to work. So encourage you again to understand the life cycle of your product and whether the way that you've identified it, the way that you've described it, is really going to support a whole host of other activities. More of the same. So again, just sort of a wrap-up slide here. Things to think about as you are moving through UDI adoption and implementation, really understanding your products and all of the activities that are associated with it. And with that, I thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you very much. A very interesting talk, even for a hospital pharmacist. I'm wondering, in your regulations, because in coming years to come, there'll be a lot of on-site 3D printing. Is that going to be calculated? How do you use that in the system later?
Very good question. I think one of the things that we did in the US, and I think we'll see it in other regulators as well, is really a hands-off approach to technology. And so we're really relying on GS1 and the other issuing agencies to manage the appropriate implementation of new technologies. So we unlike in the pharmaceutical space in the US where things are very prescriptive and described, right? It's a NDC and a linear barcode. We're seeing now with the traceability requirements, very specific requirements for now a two-dimensional barcode, which is appropriate today, but who knows what 5 years will bring. So in the device space, we've really said, you know, we're gonna let the GS1s of the world manage the appropriate implementation of new technology. So I think that's really what I hope other regulators do as well. So I think we'll start to see some very interesting things come along. We've only touched really on RFID in the medical device space. That there's obviously a whole set of opportunities there. And I really look to this group and groups like it to help us move that forward appropriately. It's interesting you raise it because we still have the linear barcode debate. I mean, we have manufacturers who say to us, I can't get rid of my linear barcode because, I've got stakeholders that only have, laser scanners. And we're like, okay, but people they are moving to 2D. So, we're still kind of in that Stone Age discussion, and I think it's be a while before we have that sort of future state discussion. But I look forward to it. So, thank you. Oh, no, you can't ask a question.
This is a softball for you, Jay.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
So going back to your discussion around collecting all of the data for the good ID, I mean,
Right.
to your point, it is a huge monumental effort.
Right.
But what would your suggestions be to maintaining that data and keeping it clean?
Right.
And what you've seen, are companies prepared to sustain that data cleanliness and accuracy? Because we've already heard that the FDA has used that data to go back and conduct audits.
Right. You already know the answer to this, but I will state it anyway, which is that for most manufacturers that we've seen, they don't really have a process in place to manage the data long term. I've collected the data, I've submitted it to FDA, I'm done, right? Life is good. So having a master data management program, right, not just a process, but a program in place that allows you to manage the evolution of that data. It will change, it will evolve. Your devices change, your devices evolve, the data associated with them as well. So having that in place will be critical, and having the data up to date will be critical. It'll be interesting, I think. You raise a very interesting point about audits, inspections. It'll be very interesting to see how, not if, but how regulators use that data to conduct regulatory inspections, for example. They will use that as they do other information, other tools, adverse events, for example. They will use that to really start to poke holes in, if you will, I don't know if that translates well, but poke holes in your processes. They're really going to look to see that you have systems in place, you have processes, you're following those processes to manage that data long term. That will become, I think, a very critical activity, not only for a manufacturer, but in any inspection or audit that you undertake. So it's a great point. I feel like most people are relieved just to get the data in, and now to think about managing it long term, they can't even really get their heads wrapped around it yet. So it's a great point.
Jay, have you seen any sort of follow-up within the dental industry? A lot of this discussion is focused on hospitals, but as some of us know, devices also include orthodontics and dental devices. So have you heard any uptick or seen any interest in that area?
Actually, we have. We have a number of dental clients. I'm actually shocked a bit at how large, at least in the U.S., the dental industry is, and I'm sure it is globally as well. And actually, we found them to be quite responsive. I think you're right, we don't typically we talk about hospitals, really sort of tertiary care, more than we think about some of the alternative site kinds of activities that go on. So we see the dental industry moving actually fairly quickly to the adoption of standards to putting G10s on their products. What isn't clear at all is what the dentist is going to do, or anyone downstream, in terms of actually managing the data at that level. So unlike, I think, where in the US we see sort of that loop closing with documentation of device use, whether it's for reimbursement or electronic health records, or even from a supply chain perspective, where we see an uptake that's beginning for UDI. I think the dental industry right now is a very open loop process. So we see dental manufacturers putting G10s on products and actually doing it quite well, but nobody else in that life cycle actually doing anything with it. So It's a great point, and I think one that will eventually come around, and I think it's true of a number of the other care sites that we don't typically talk about.
Thank you very much.
Yes, you're quite welcome. Thank you.